What was the word of the Lord that came to the man of God against Jeroboam? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 1 Kings on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing 1 Kings chapter 13, verses 1 to 10. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to 1 Kings chapter 13, verse 1. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 1 Kings chapter 13, beginning at verse 1. And behold, a man of God went from Judah to Bethel by the word of the Lord, and Jeroboam stood by the altar to burn incense. Then he cried out against the altar by the word of the Lord, and said, O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a child, Josiah by name, shall be born to the house of David, and on you he shall sacrifice the priests of the high places who burn incense on you, and men's bones shall be burned on you. And he gave a sign the same day, saying, This is the sign which the Lord has spoken. Surely the altar shall split apart, and the ashes on it shall be poured out. So it came to pass, when King Jeroboam heard the saying of the man of God, who cried out against the altar in Bethel, that he stretched out his hand from the altar, saying, Arrest him. Then his hand, which he stretched out towards him, withered, so that he could not pull it back to himself. The altar was also split apart, and the ashes poured out from the altar, according to the sign which the man of God had given by the word of the Lord. Then the king answered and said to the man of God, Please entreat the favor of the Lord your God, and pray for me, that my hand may be restored to me. So the man of God entreated the Lord, and the king's hand was restored to him, and became as before. And the king said to the man of God, Come home with me, and refresh yourself, and I will give you a reward. But the man of God said to the king, If you were to give me half your house, I would not go with you, nor would I eat bread nor drink water in this place. For so it was commanded me by the word of the Lord, saying, You shall not eat bread, nor drink water, nor return by the same way you came. So he went another way, and did not return by the way he came to Bethel. At the end of the last chapter, we saw Jeroboam set up 2 calves in Israel for them to worship at instead of Jerusalem, one in Dan in the north of Israel, and one in Bethel in the south, right on the border with Judah. In fact, from the Temple Mount, one could likely see Bethel on a clear day, meaning this altar in Bethel could likely be seen from there. This was the sin that Israel never repented of and resulted in her captivity by the Assyrians some 200 years later. We didn't mention this in the last lesson, but it is worthy to note that the Levites didn't offer sacrifices on these altars. They remained faithful to God and offered sacrifices on the altar in Jerusalem, so Jeroboam had to set up his own priests. These priests were ordinary people, according to chapter 12, verse 31, meaning that they weren't sanctified for the work of the Lord, because this wasn't the work of the Lord. Coming now to chapter 13, and we find God's response to all of this idolatry in Israel. Instead of sending down fire from heaven or sending a great plague, what God did was send a man of God from Judah to prophesy against this altar in Bethel. The prophecy is a peculiar one, for not only does it contain words that God would one day destroy this altar and burn dead men's bones on it, which would be an abomination on any altar to a supposed god, but the prophecy contained the name of the man who would do it, Josiah, a son from the house of David. Note, the prophecy didn't simply say one from the house of David would do this, like many of the messianic prophecies do. It mentioned Josiah by name. There are very few prophecies in the Old Testament this specific about a future event, perhaps the prophecy about Cyrus releasing the Jews from captivity being the most famous. This has led some biblical scholars to surmise that Josiah was later added by a copyist of the text, and that the man of God was actually quite general, only mentioning a future son of the house of David destroying the altar. The problem with this is we do not have any manuscript evidence to date where Josiah's name is missing from this text. Sure, if it was missing, and if this was later a copyist edition, it wouldn't change the prophecy one bit, for God brought it about just over 300 years later. But if the Bible believer believes that God works in the kingdoms of men to bring about his will, Why couldn't he be specific here in telling us how he would do it? Sure, God doesn't often act this way, but that's different than saying he cannot act this way. God doesn't write the future ahead of time, but he can bring about events to accomplish his purpose, and as such can prophesy about a man named Josiah and then bring about the fulfillment. This is how powerful God is. I have no problem believing that the man of God was specific here concerning this altar, and that this section was written in its totality before the events took place, and neither should you. The sign that the man of God was speaking the truth was that the altar would be split apart and the ashes would spill to the ground. Now naturally, Jeroboam, who was there offering sacrifices, was angry at this pronouncement against his new altar and stretched out his hand for someone to arrest the man of God. No sooner had Jeroboam stretched out his hand than it withered so he couldn't move it. Now this doesn't mean that his hand shriveled up, but that it became paralyzed so that he could no longer move it. A debilitating disease for a king for sure. And what's more, the altar was split in two and the ashes poured out just as the man of God had said. Now Jeroboam wasn't a stupid man, even if he was an unrepentant one, and so he entreated the man of God to pray to God that the use of his hand be restored. The man of God obliged, and God did restore Jeroboam's hand. But the damage was done. The word of the Lord was spoken against this altar. But instead of repenting, nothing really seemed to change. Now, yes, Jeroboam was thankful to the man of God, wanting the man of God to return and eat in his house, but the false altar would be restored, and the idol worship would continue. What we do learn, though, is that the man of God wouldn't return with Jeroboam, telling Jeroboam that no amount of money could cause him to do so, for the Lord had spoken to him, telling him when he went to prophesy against the altar, he wasn't to eat with anyone while there, and was it to immediately return to Judah using a different way than he came. Why? Well, he wasn't going to accept hospitality from apostates, for that might construe agreement with their evil deeds. As for why he was to return a different way, perhaps that was a protection for the man of God, so that nobody he saw on the way there would find him on the way back and cause him trouble. We'll never know for sure, but needless to say, it was a command of God that needed to be followed. We'll find out how well this prophet followed that command, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 1 Kings chapter 13, verses 11 to 22, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.